eminent panelists in the first session will discuss and deliberate on the Indo-UK partnership in the Indo-Pacific context. Allow me to give a small perspective about the first session. At the Milken Institute Asia Summit, UK Foreign Secretary Mr. James Cleverly spoke about the strategic importance that UK places on the Indo-Pacific region and promoting partnership through shared value of partner countries. To quote him verbatim, the UK and many Indo-Pacific countries are committed to shared values. Our commitment to sovereignty and territorial integrity and freedom from economic coercion. Our shared beliefs in the value of democracy and open markets. The sentiments of Foreign Secretary indeed mirror the actions, initiatives, and ongoing negotiations with respect to free trade agreements being undertaken between the two countries. That being said, Britain's strategic role in the Indo-Pacific region in collaboration with India and vice versa needs further deliberation and ideation. The two nations can surely play a constructive role in building the regional governance architecture. The session includes a question and answer session round towards the end. I request your participation and undivided attention in order to enrich the discussion in the theme. The chair for the first technical session is Dr. W. Lawrence S. Prabhakar. He is an advisor to CPPR. He is also an author, researcher, and professor in International Relations and Strategic Studies. He was associated formerly with the Department of Political Science, Madras Christian College. I invite Dr. W. Lawrence S. Prabhakar to the dais. Now, I would like to welcome the panelists for the session. I welcome Dr. Sidharth Raimedhi. He is an adjunct professor at Jindal School of International Affairs. He serves as a research fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi. I welcome Dr. Sidharth Raimedhi to the dais. I welcome Ms. Mahima Duggal. She is an associate fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. Kindly take the dais. Now I would like to invite Dr. Shelly Johnny B. He is an assistant professor of political science at St. Aloysius College, Thrissur, and he is also a senior fellow in investigation and security studies at Center for Public Policy Research, Kochi. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Anna Francis, for the kind words of introduction. I thank the Lord God for giving me this opportunity to come to CPPR and to give this chair this session and give some remarks. I'd also like to thank Dr. Dhanaraj and Team CPPR, along with the British High Commission, for this excellent arrangements of this very important seminal theme of the conference. To set the setting for the decoding of the Indo-Pacific, I would like to present to you certain remarks which I think will form the basis by which our conversation will go. The Indo-Pacific is what we know today, is the new Indo-Pacific that has come. Because there are two phases of the Indo-Pacific. One was during the World War II, when Britain was a preeminent power. Great Britain was a preeminent power. And today's Indo-Pacific has a different galaxy of actors, which we find, which has both the potential for growth as well as potential for what you could call as great power conflict. So what we could see in terms of, in contemporary international relations, perhaps this is one region which has attracted much attention after the Euro-Atlantic. And there are 5 areas which I would like to basically look into what this Indo-Pacific is all about. The Indo-Pacific strategy of many of the countries look into deterring of authoritarian states, bolstering of economic growth and trade, fostering economic interdependence and the creation of new economic frameworks, burnishing infrastructure development and enhancing security convergence among other powers. And when we talk about security convergence, we look into both the regional states as well as external states, of which prominently the United Kingdom is an external state which has got consummate interest in the Indo-Pacific there. Since the UK's withdrawal from the east of Suez in 1972 and withdrawal from Hong Kong in 1997, the United Kingdom has come with a very great decisive determination in terms of what it calls the integrated review that it was able to draft in recent times, and the pronounced British tilt towards the Indo-Pacific has been very much evident there. There are 5 reasons why I think the UK has come back to the Indo-Pacific is very important. There is something called the Indo-Pacific economic robustness of growth, because a number of economic cooperative frameworks in the Indo-Pacific are much more than the rest of the other world there. China and the Indo-Pacific visage is prompting the British come back into the region, in as much as the staying power of the Americans are now being cast into doubt actually there. Therefore, there is an European component to the Indo-Pacific of re-engagement in the region there. And of course, what we find is the British are trying to convey the message of what is called reassurance to their allies in their existing commitments, like the Five Powers Defense Agreement and the newly formed AUKUS, which is now coming into a lot of prominence and conversation there. Fifthly, the British are also involved in what we could call as public diplomacy exercises in the region there, because the Indo-Pacific is known for its very extensive commons, which basically has a large scope of what we could call as the public diplomacy that could come into that there. What is this new Indo-Pacific all about? The new Indo-Pacific is all about economic frameworks. Even as grappling what we could call the China threat, or the visage of China threat is there, we find that the new frameworks are actually playing a more prominent role than the conflictual situation there. And therefore, we have something like the IPE of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the East Asian Summit, the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the RCEP of China, and the APEC. These frameworks are actually garnering more attention in terms of what the new Indo-Pacific is all about there. At the same time, we find that the new Indo-Pacific is all about connectivity and infrastructure growth that is expanding in the region. And as vying with the Chinese BRI, we find that Japan and the United States are also looking into quality standards of what we could call as infrastructure growth there. At the same time, the Indo-Pacific is also conflictual when we look into the East China Sea disputes, the South China Sea disputes that have been basically looked into that. However, most importantly, we find that there is a democratic consensus of democratic powers, which are coming in more in terms of the quadrilateral security dialogue, as well as in the European powers, namely the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, which do have substantial democratic credentials in the engagement of what we could call as a democratic charter of the Indo-Pacific. In a short sense, we can say that the Indo-Pacific is more in terms of what we could call an emerging Indo-Pacific charter, which is likely to come, which will be based upon democratic ideals there. Indo-Pacific is also, the new Indo-Pacific is also burnishing in terms of institutionalism and regionalism. And we find that institutionalism and regionalism are gelling with each other and syncing with each other there. And the global commons of the Indo-Pacific is such vast that the tasks of these powers, both regional powers and external powers, are immense, and there's substantive level of coordination and cooperation there. The new Indo-Pacific looks for what we could call as the rules-based order, and the rules-based order is something that is espoused by the democratic powers, and therefore that consensus is yet another burnishing ideal that comes into the region there. And most importantly, the Indo-Pacific is a region, what we could see in terms of what we will call the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiatives. And the vision outlooks of India, ASEAN, Australia, Japan, and the United States are all adding towards what we could call having an Indo-Pacific vision on a common page. That is another interesting development of the new Indo-Pacific actually there. What are the terms of reference of the Indo-Pacific, UK Indo-Pacific Agreement? And we find that in the integrated review that the British government had recently posted, we find that what we would call the carrier diplomacy of the Carrier Strike Group 21 of the HMS Queen Elizabeth sailing all the way to the Far East. And we find that the UK Joint Logistics Base in Oman is basically the place from which they are operating much of the Indo-Pacific operations. The AUKUS is the mainstay of what we would call the coming of the UK into the region, along with the United States in burnishing what we would call Australia's deterrence credentials. The Five Powers Defense Agreement, in terms of its exercises, in terms of its other initiatives, are working along with the other powers in the region. Most importantly, we find that the UK has a major economic interest in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and it has got much less in South Asia, which needs more improving to come into that there. Let me just highlight prospects for India's partnership with the UK. I think India has been partnering with the UK since 2004, and we find that this partnership is gaining attention even as the Chinese threat seems to be at the horizon. UK brings into table very extensive diplomatic, military, intelligence, humanitarian disaster response capacities into the region there. And the conclusion of the comprehensive strategic partnership is actually opening up different vistas of the Indo-UK cooperation there. The United Kingdom has accepted India's IPOI, and in the sense that they are on the common page as far as the Indo-Pacific outlook is concerned there. And therefore we find that this has also been bolstered along with the India-UK free trade agreement, which is going on at a swift round of conclusion of talks there. So that essentially brings in a global Britain into this region, which is actually the post-Brexit area, where Britain is basically looking for strategic partners, and India basically is an important partner that comes into that there. And what we find here is the comprehensive strategic review and the India-UK roadmap of 2030. These are important documents which actually present what we could call the vision for the India-UK partnership. Even as the UK is more concentrated in the Ukraine war, we find that the British tilt towards the Indo-Pacific seems to be somewhat been over-exaggerated, because Britain's limited capacities and capabilities will be called to question if there is going to be a two-front scenario there. The UK is also a dialogue partner of the IORA, and also we find that there are increasing routine carrier deployments of the UK into the Indian Ocean region, which is coming there. And therefore what we find is that the India-UK partnership in the long term will not only look in terms of traditional security threats, but also non-traditional challenges which will come to play in terms of pandemics, in terms of cyber security, in terms of counter-terrorism there. And finally, let me point out some pointers for the speakers. One is how best do you think that the India-UK partnership will have a joint UK-India vision for the Indo-Pacific? This is something that we can explore. What will be the new synergies of cooperation between India and UK in the coming years leading up to 2030? What will be the security and defense partnerships between India and UK that will burnish India's technological base in the coming years? And how could UK's strengths in coalition building and multinational security partnership help India in the Indo-Pacific? And what would be the prospects of India and UK in terms of trade and technology relationships there? These are the issues I'd like to place, and I'll stop here. We'd like to have the panelists to come and give the word, their own versions of the Decoding the Indo-Pacific, and then we'll have the conversation. Thank you, God bless.
Thank you for your comments. I think it really sets the stage for what I wanted to say. And I'll try to take on the pointers as faithfully as I can. But when I was first invited to the conference, I took it as an opportunity to actually try to dive into Britain's recent tilt. I was not very well informed or aware of it. So please consider my own presentation as my own exploration of how I made sense of it, and how I try to explore the synergies between India's evolving Indo-Pacific idea and vision as well as that of Britain's. And as soon as I started delving into it, I would say that I found myself asking very significant questions as to what it means. And that's very understandable because it's just been 2 years. The tilt was announced in 2021. And we all know that there has been a lot of cognitive disagreement, let's say, between India and Britain about the rise of China. To give you just one perspective, till as late as 2015, then Prime Minister David Cameron was describing China as a strategic partner, especially in terms of trade, of Britain. And that's a year when the two leaders decided to cooperate, especially on nuclear power plants. And now from Delhi, it is quite telling that over the last 1 year, there has been such a shift in Britain's thinking about cooperation with China, and Britain has been trying to squeeze out Chinese companies from its nuclear power plants. That is just 6 years. The other thing one would notice from Delhi, let's say, about Britain and China is exactly that, in the sense that that India was always, again, understandably, because we are in the region, we have been very cognizant of China's growing rise. We experienced some of its implications as early as early 2010s, and it took some time for Britain to finally come to terms with it. So in that sense, I also went through the House of Lords investigation committee into understanding the Indo-Pacific, which saw a lot of testimonies from the US Indo-PACOM leader and scholars and analysts. And you can see a shift in how Britain sees the rising power of China in the region. Now, as far as the tilt goes, it was, of course, it also coincided with, as was mentioned, the carrier deployment, which was historic. It was the first time in 20 years that it had come into the region, and it passed through the South China Sea. And it also followed earlier such freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Straits. But one cannot help but notice that within Britain itself, both within the government and the strategic community, there were a lot of misgivings and concerns about Britain's material capabilities. For instance, Britain has been having defense cuts over the last 10, 11 years. Its army is now reduced to around, will be reduced to around 72,000 infantrymen by 2025. The first time is the lowest since 1714. There have been similar cuts to the Royal Navy. So, and hence, of course, there were also those observations that the carrier strike group had to be reinforced by Dutch and American ships, and that Britain may not be able to afford all of the fighter jets, the F-35B fighter jets that may be required. And hence, as an Indian researcher, observer of the Indo-Pacific, it does make you wonder what role and how and what is the scope and how should we talk about Britain's tilt in the Indo-Pacific. But it's not all pessimism and doom and gloom for me, at least, and I might come to that gradually. For instance, right. So very briefly, one cognitive or narrative intervention that I would perhaps suggest is that we should look at Britain's tilt in the Indo-Pacific not just as a naval military component, but there is room for appreciating Britain's initiative, for instance, in the AUKUS itself and the joint defense production of fighter jets with Britain and Italy. And similarly, there is also reason to there is greater reason for India and Britain to look at the whole region in a more comprehensive sense, in the sense that India could probably engage with Britain more on the European front, and maybe again appreciate Britain's role within the European theater in terms of monitoring Chinese malign influence or port acquisitions and so on and so forth. And similarly, I think there might be a gap the UK might have to catch up with America's recent evolution regarding India's security threats, especially on the LAC front. There have been a lot of statements and interest within the US Senate and so on and so forth on that front. In my own conversations with my British interlocutors and partners, there has been the primary take has been that these are two nuclear powers, so we are worried about the nuclear escalation component. But now it's pretty clear that the Indo-Pacific also consists and should consist more continental security threats as well, because, as will be well known, India's maritime engagement itself will be driven by and shaped by its continental securities or insecurities. So instead of framing it as a either or zero-sum game, whether continental or maritime, there is greater need for both Britain and India to see it as a very interdependent theater where one feeds into the other rather than a zero-sum game. With that, I think I would not like to take up more time, so I hand over to
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. At the very outset, I'd like to thank the Center for Public Policy Research and the British High Commission for inviting me to speak today. I must also congratulate you on holding this event at a very appropriate time, just on the heels of UK's Integrated Review Refresh, which was released just about, I think, 10 days ago. This new document follows the integrated review, which was released by the Johnson government in 21 and which has already been brought up by my fellow panelists here. Essentially, it looks to update Britain's policy direction in view of a much more contested, a much more volatile world. So this is what I want to focus on a bit today. I feel that it is important to note that the timing of the 21 review, it was released merely months after London and Brussels finalized a new framework for the EU-UK relationship post-Brexit. And this really influenced what the integrated review of 21 was trying to do. It was, trying to actively establish UK's global role and new identity in a post-Brexit world. It did so by outlining very clearly policy objectives and priorities for a global Britain moving forward. What made the 21 review of immense interest to India is that it was the first official document from UK that defined London's outlook towards the Indo-Pacific region. It was widely celebrated, as we've talked about this morning, as Britain's tilt towards the Indo-Pacific, and with the aim of becoming the European partner with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific region. The review sort of signaled greater willingness on London's part to increase its regional defense engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So over the last 2 years, Britain has certainly acted upon this tilt. It has achieved several of the key objectives it laid out in the 21 review, which is remarkable. For instance, it has attained dialogue partner status with ASEAN. It has pursued it is, I think, in the final phase, actually, of negotiations of accession to the CPTPP. It is launching a Singapore hub of the British international investments, and it is also launching partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative. So there is a lot of political work happening in this arena. And on the defense side, too, we have seen a lot of military deployments to the region, which indicate Britain's consistent interest. The Carrier Strike Group 21, 22 deployment of 2 river-class offshore patrol vessels. There is also a planned deployment, I believe, of the new amphibious littoral response group in 23. And these moves indicate how serious the UK is about the Indo-Pacific. It is expanding the AUKUS program now. I think it was recently released after 18 months. The new plans for AUKUS have been released, which will be interesting to see how they proceed forward. And it is also working on defense industry ties with Japan, for instance, on the Global Combat Air Program to build next-generation fighters. So for the most part, UK's tilt has been welcomed as a positive effort towards greater burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific, including by India. There are some who have questioned, have looked at it with skepticism, who have, questioned whether this degree of enthusiasm and will be sustainable in the long run. Some believe that with the war in Ukraine, London will be too stretched. And it would sort of be forced to reevaluate its position and essentially hit the brakes in its investment in the Indo-Pacific region. But as we can see, I don't think that has quite happened. In the review refresh, I think, is a good example in this context. It is a much-needed document which lays out a much more pragmatic approach to British foreign policy, and it presents a very realistic assessment of the rapidly deteriorating global security environment. It's in a much more sober tone compared to the 21 review, which was criticized as being maybe overly ambitious and maybe a little boosterist, if you understand. But this one has been accepted well. It's being treated as a very as an excellent insight into how Britain can move forward. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight with the review refresh. First of all, it very explicitly explains how Britain's core interest is in its immediate neighborhood of Euro-Atlantic, and of course countering the Russia threat therein. But, despite, which is a fair assessment, but despite this, it treats Indo-Pacific as an extremely notable part of London's security outlook. Indo-Pacific is given a lot of attention as a domain that is inherently and inextricably linked to the security of the Euro-Atlantic. It doubles down on Britain's focus on the Indo-Pacific region amid an awareness that the tensions in the theater, especially those which are emanating from China, have long-term consequences which could be much, much greater than the war in Ukraine at the moment. So as a footnote here, this has already been discussed to some extent, but I should mention that the refresh also sets forward a new direction in Britain's China policy. It's not the paradigm shift that the Liz Truss government, for instance, was hoping for, defining China as a blatant threat to British security, but it does identify Beijing as an epoch-defining and systemic challenge with implications for almost every area of government policy. This sort of follows the European thinking, to some extent at least, of walking a fine line of treating China as a rival, but also a necessary partner in certain domains where engagement is necessary and there is no way around it. So in this context, London recognizes how important it is to support enhancing security capabilities of its regional allies and institutionalizing greater cooperation with its Indo-Pacific partners, including India. I think UK is already leading efforts to establish a much more permanent European presence, maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific, and the integrated review refresh sort of doubles down on this and molds British tilt to the Indo-Pacific as more of a permanent pillar of its foreign and security policy. So I'll just take a few more minutes to talk about what opportunities there are for Britain and India in the Indo-Pacific region. Over the last few years since the 21 review, there have been a lot of developments in this domain. I've seen, of course, the UK-India roadmap is an important document guiding their relationship forward, but also British participation in the IPOI as a pillar of the maritime security domain, and the India-UK FTA, also India-UK discussions on collaborating in the defense domain, such as with jet engines. So there are a lot of strides happening here. But there is still a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room where much more work can be done. Britain's engagement is a positive force for India, while New Delhi deals with its own challenges with respect to China, and it attempts to sort of be an active player shaping the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. A stronger British presence means that there can be, a stronger potential coalition structure, which may need to be mobilized at some point in the future to check Chinese advances and Chinese expansionism and to protect the global liberal order. So with that long-term view, India does welcome British engagement with the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS has brought a lot of attention to British efforts in the Pacific, just because it is such a major framework, a defining framework for the region. But there is a lot that the UK can do in the Indian Ocean itself, especially in the maritime security domain. Recently, India and UK began tri-service drills. UK has also participated in the Quad's Malabar exercises in the Bay of Bengal, and UK's deployments can create more ad hoc opportunities for engagement, for military engagement, not only with India, but also, as part of a minilateral of sorts with maybe Australia as 3 Indian Ocean powers coming together. With the view of providing public good, I also believe that India and Britain must explore how they can enhance their cooperation in maritime domain awareness and dark shipping, and how they can help regional states build stronger ocean governance frameworks, and how they can help smaller states sort of better respond to non-traditional challenges that are brought on by climate change now. Also, there is a lot of work that UK can do in the quality connectivity infrastructure domain. And I'm following this from Japan's model. Japan has become an absolutely indispensable partner for India when it comes to infrastructure needs in South Asia and Southeast Asia. We rely on Japan a lot in this domain, but UK can be an equally essential partner here moving forward. This can come about in, through various platforms like the recently launched Infrastructure for Resilient Island States platform, but also the existing multilateral platforms like Indian Ocean Rim Association and BIMSTEC. BIMSTEC especially, I believe, is an area which requires much more focus moving forward, including for domains like supply chain resilience. I think I'll just end here. I've exceeded my time a little bit, but I hope this gives you some food for thought, and I look forward to discussing it more in the discussions part of the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank CPPR and the British High Commission, New Delhi, for giving me the opportunity to be part of this first session of this conference. What I would like to focus on is India-UK defense and strategic cooperation in the Northwest Indian Ocean region. And I expect that the discussion would include this area as well. Because often what we see is, especially in the present juncture, what we see when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, there is a lot of attention on the Eastern Indian Ocean region, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. Whereas there is a tendency to shift the attention from the Northwest Indian Ocean region, especially the Arabian Sea, or the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea regions. Because they should be considered as very important with regard to studying the overall significance of the Indo-Pacific region. Because as we know, despite technological advancement and the development of air power, air technology, and so on, when it comes to the maritime realm, the Northwest Indian Ocean region is important because it links the Mediterranean Sea with the wider Indo-Pacific. So it is quite important. And when it comes to cooperation between India and the UK, there is a lot of potential because both these countries have collaborated with other nation states on a frequent basis. So they have got common allies in this region, and they can collaborate together and bring about a much secure Northwest Indian Ocean region. Now, when it comes to collaboration between India and the UK, we understand that there is a lot of positives with regard to this relationship, because there is likely to be a better understanding on the part of the UK on India's concerns while being part of the Quad, and India being part of the Quad, as not wanting to appear as a kind of aggressive vis-a-vis China, because we know that the UK has got very strong trade relations with China. So in some ways, India expects a much better understanding from the UK, maybe even in comparison to its other partners within the Quad. So now, with regard to, I'm not going into the general issues with regard to UK-India partnership in the Indo-Pacific, because most of those points have been already mentioned and they're going to be discussed in detail in these 2 days. But when it comes to the Northwest Indian Ocean region, there are certain concerns with regard to the certain divergences in the perspectives of the UK and India. Though Pakistan is not as much as an irritant with regard to India-UK partnership as it was previously, because the nature of the relationship has become more global, in the sense that India's concerns have become more global in nature rather than being confined to South Asia as it was previously. So which is a good sign, because India wanted that kind of the global kind of perspective, a global kind of role that India wished to have. There is still the concern that when it comes to issues like terrorism and using the Arabian Sea, the waterways to conduct terrorist attacks in India, the close defense relations that both the Pakistan and the UK have with each other is still a point of concern. Especially, we know that we already know a lot about the terrorist attacks that have been conducted in India using the Arabian Sea maritime circuits. In 2014, there was the attempt to take over a Pakistani frigate by Al-Qaeda terrorists with the cooperation of Pakistani naval personnel who were recruited by Al-Qaeda in 2014. And there was a danger that this warship would be used against US warships in the Arabian Sea. So in the present scenario in Pakistan with the political situation, the conflict in Pakistan, the economic crisis, the terrorist attacks, both the UK and India should have more collaboration and cooperation with regard to facing likely threats in case the situation in Pakistan becomes more volatile and there is a threat of further attacks. And also, when we look at China's role in the Indo-Pacific, it is not just limited to the Pacific Ocean or the South China Sea or even the Eastern Indian Ocean. China is very much active in trying to gain access to naval bases in the Red Sea region, the Horn of Africa region. It has got its first international naval base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. So, and a lot of nation states are in the competition to gain access to ports and naval military bases in the Horn of Africa. So here Britain and India can do a lot if they can collaborate with each other and ensure the freedom of navigation in that region, because China has got access, it can influence the shipping lanes, affect the shipping lanes in that region. So there is a lot that India and China can do in that region. So taking these things into account, both India and UK need to go beyond the colonial the context and the Cold War context, where there are a lot of legacies that have still remain, but recognize that there is a new era where both the two countries need to collaborate, come together in order to deal with the new changed international scenario that we are facing right now. So with that, with those words, I would like to stop right now, and I expect that we'll have further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for these three presentations. At the first stage, we'll have a conversation mode of asking questions, and then we'll open up to the floor actually there. I'll start with Dr. Sidharth in terms of his presentation. What do you think would be the non-military dimensions of British tilt towards the Indo-Pacific? Do you think that will be more significant? Will they bring in more ballast to play on the ground than the military aspect?
Yeah, I think in terms of non-military, there is immense opportunity, and for instance, ocean governance has been mentioned. Definitely, that's one. Building institutions, helping build institutions, reinforcing and bringing about greater cooperation between institutions. For instance, other than that, I think human rights is one issue, although it's slightly controversial, but I think Britain is very much interested in the human rights situation, especially in China and various other countries as well. But a larger diplomatic role as well. For instance, Britain, I think, is intent on improving its relations with existing traditional partners like Singapore, Malaysia and Oman and so on and so forth, and it's also looking to expand its relations with other countries. I think a lot of the competition in the region, as rightly pointed out, even in the defense command paper which came along with the international review, is in a way it's hinting at a competition for partnerships, alliances and friends. To give you just one example, for instance, India can help Britain anchor itself in various third countries with which it might not have had great relations. For instance, Maldives would be one example that would come to my mind. India has, as of now, great relations with Maldives. And to give you another example, for instance, I also see a lot of similarities between what's happened in the South Pacific Islands, the Solomon Island incident, for instance, and how there was a race to provide governance in a way, law and order issue, and whose police forces will go there, what kind of cooperation, and so on and so forth. So in the future of the Indian Ocean, a lot of these island countries, we are likely to see a lot of civil disturbances, probably disputes regarding electoral outcomes, and so on and so forth. And it will be very hard for India to go it alone in terms of intervention, because India is already seen as very heavy-handed, hegemonic, and so on and so forth. It's too early now to think about instituting something like that, but greater cooperation between India and like-minded partners in coming up with a common diplomatic approach to handle such situations so that authoritarian states cannot exploit them, because that is one of the most significant ways in which authoritarian states seem to have been expanding their influence over the last few years. So there's a lot to be done there.
The next question I would like to ask is, to what extent do you think India and the UK can find synergies in the non-military areas of possible engagement?
Synergies, I think there's a lot. For instance, the topic is ideating the Indo-Pacific. So I think there is a greater need for think tanks, academics, scholars, writers to engage more in terms of how we ideate the Indo-Pacific, because for instance, I don't think it's very clear to a lot of Indians about what Britain's interests are regarding the region as of now. Some would say it's commercial because there's a lot of mention of defense attaches and also exports to Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. Others sometimes also see it as a quid pro quo with the Americans, for the US helping the British out in their region. British is like reciprocating by involving itself more there. So, but I think there is, the discussion needs to be broader in order to identify the synergy and the common aspirations and values. For instance, the case can be made that Britain has historically always been interested in the continental balance of power. Like it's a foreign policy that goes back 400 or more years, and hence it is naturally in Britain's interest to keep the sea lanes and communication and commerce open, to really maintain them as both global and commons rather than national. And so there is great scope for understanding that, and I think from there synergy can arrive. But of course, with the caveat that Britain's balance of power policy has always been focused on Europe, and because it's closer to home, so it's not a hard sell to the British public that we need to maintain this balance in Europe. But it is a bit of a hard sell to argue that the average Brit, the taxpayer, should focus on South China Sea. So there is a lot of scope that for the narrative and for it needs better public diplomacy, both externally at the region and internally at times, both within India and Britain, to keep the focus on what's important. And sometimes it's a bit hard to argue for that because immediate threats, Russia, Ukraine, and so on and so forth.
How much of Britain's rhetoric and the reality balance with each other? Because their vision is grandiose, but do they have the substantial resources to back what they say actually?
I mean, that's actually the key of what I also wanted to discuss and throw out in the open as well. I think it's basically two choices are involved here. One, or maybe they are complementary to each other. I think the more we focus on the British Navy and the carrier strike group and all that, the more it allows opportunity to be skeptical about it, in a way, to compare it to the Chinese Navy, to compare it to the Chinese interests or other countries' interests in the region and Britain's own interests. But the alternative is to look at British power in a broader way. It's not just the Navy, not just capabilities. It doesn't have to always cost a lot. Yes, soft power should be a big part of it. It's diplomatic power. For instance, as we speak, in South Asia, it's involved in the Myanmar conflict as well as a voluntary mediator. It has stakes in the country, in the Commonwealth. It had given significant aid to Pakistan as well during the flood situation. It has significant influence there. So in that sense, sorry, what was the question again?
How much can it back its...
Oh, yeah, can it back itself? Yeah. So I think also we can highlight Britain's role in the ongoing Ukraine war in the sense that it has been very helpful in terms of being one of the first to cross the threshold in terms of delivering aid and weapons, the Challenger tanks, the anti-tank missiles and aid and funding. And Boris Johnson, I think, was one of the first prime ministers to show up in Kiev during a very difficult part of the war. I think that itself is a great narrative to amplify in the Indo-Pacific. I think Britain is losing out on that. It has come to the aid of a relatively small country in Europe. Again, continuing with a long tradition, like Second World War was about Poland, First World War, the defense of Belgium. The defense of small countries is very much a core value of British foreign policy, as well as its strategic interest. And once we understand how these two integrate, then we can have a more optimistic sense of British both interests, capabilities, and the hope that they'd be able to tie together all their various powers and influence into making an impact. For instance, even complicating authoritarian countries' operations or influence is itself a great contribution.
Thank you. Dr. Duggal, what do you think would be the prospective partnerships that Britain would have with Japan in conjunction with India in the light of what they call as quality infrastructure developments that can be done? Can you envision some of these ideas there?
Yes, I do think that, quality infrastructure is one area where UK can do a lot because of its immense resources. Again, it depends on how much resources it is willing to commit to the region. But quality infrastructure is the need of the hour for the Indo-Pacific, not only in Southeast Asia, but especially in South Asia, where there is some $60 billion, I believe, according to the latest estimate by ADB. So there is a lot that UK can do. But yes, it must be done in partnership with regional actors, as you said. And I think BIMSTEC is actually an excellent platform for this. I don't see IOR as a very effective mechanism at the moment, but BIMSTEC is rising in its profile, and India is investing a lot in it at the moment. And this is one area where, as a dialogue partner, the UK could come in, sort of support support financing of initiatives that BIMSTEC countries are undertaking. It could work in tandem with partners like Japan and Australia. And this is very important in terms of providing regional states an alternative to the BRI. We are still, grappling with how massive the BRI has become since its onset, and we do not yet have an adequate solution to it. There is no, one program that can really counter the BRI, but what we can do is work in different settings, in different smaller mechanisms to sort of counter aspects of the BRI, and this is being done to some extent through frameworks like the Blue Dot Network, which again has received a new momentum in the last few months. So I think there is a lot that the UK can do in this arena in tandem with India, Japan, and Australia, which are regional powers and therefore very much trusted by these small state actors.
Now, considering the fact that the UK has a substantial investment interests and posture in Southeast Asia, what have they done with regard to South Asia, Indian Ocean? Because not much has been done, except that they have been only a dialogue partner of the IORA there, actually there. So what areas do you envision will be British involvement in this region, actually there?
Yes, I mean, compared to Southeast Asia, British involvement in South Asia has been much more muted. There are a lot of reasons behind this. I mean, South Asia, it's not always easy dealing with a region like South Asia, which comprises of so many different countries, so many different lines of flux between them, not just India, Pakistan, but there are several territorial disputes, several issues of, threads of disagreement between these states, and working with South Asia as a region, as a whole region, holistically, is a difficult endeavor. So, while on the other hand, working with ASEAN is a much more attractive prospect. So that is why I think this disparity occurs. But moving forward, again, there can be areas where Britain can support South Asian development. Apart from the quality infrastructure domain, which I talked about, one immediate sort of outreach that UK could do, for instance, is maybe deploy a military liaison to BIMSTEC, like several other countries have done. So this, brings a defense security engagement dimension to its outreach to South Asia, and it can also work on defense export deals to BIMSTEC nations. So that is one area where it can move forward immediately. Like Japan, it can also enter into joint financial ventures with India. I think that would be one good way forward in the non-military domain. And of course, for smaller South Asian nations, for smaller Indian Ocean region nations rather, climate change is a major security concern. I mean, I was listening to representatives from Maldives, for instance, and it is not just a distant reality for them, but it is something that they must deal with right now at this very hour. And they are looking for innovative solutions. They're looking for partners which can support their capacity building, which can provide, technical expertise, which is very much necessary. And there are a lot of European states which can support this. For instance, the Netherlands has often been brought up as a partner, but because UK already has investments in the Indian Ocean region, why not UK? Why can't it be an essential partner stepping up in this domain? So I hope that answers.
Could be that. Now, concerning seabed mining, do you think the British will have interest in the region, particularly in the Indian Ocean region? Because India has been prospecting on that. What will be British technology inputs that would come into that?
I cannot go into very technical details on this, but I definitely, when we talk about maritime security, and UK is the lead of the maritime pillar, when we talk about the IPOI, then definitely this could be one way forward, explorations and so on. That is something the Indian and British navies could work on together. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Shelly Johnny, how do you find British access and basing in the West Asian region, particularly in Duqm, particularly in Oman, the joint logistics base? How does that actually work out for the outflow of British influence, presence, and posture, both in the northern Indian Ocean as well as in the regular Indian Ocean there?
I think it's something that is not much discussed, because in the sense there is always this tendency to focus on UK, US relations with Saudi Arabia and UAE, the more high profile kind of agreements. But these are very important. For example, Oman is the only GCC state which has an Indian Ocean shoreline, and is very useful for this purpose in that sense, where Britain can use the Duqm port facilities to extend into the Indo-Pacific region. Likewise, Bahrain is also very important. So I think that what you rightly mentioned when you spoke first, that South Asia is kind of, with regard to UK, South Asia is a missing part of the puzzle with regard to access to naval facilities and so on. So in that sense, the Gulf Cooperation Council bases are very important. When you have to skip South Asia to link it up with the Southeast Asian region. So in that sense, it is quite important. And what is important with regard to relationship between the UK and India is that India has got similar collaboration with these two countries. So it would be a very similar kind of a strategic cooperation that has been going on, though albeit in a separate manner. I mean, between these GCC states and UK on the one side and GCC and India on the other. So linking up with these countries, both India and UK, I think would be a very impactful for the wider region. Yeah.
What do you perceive as non-traditional threats to security in the northern Indian Ocean region, and what are British perspectives on that?
I think the kind of, in fact, if we look at in the 2000s, one of the major reasons a lot of major maritime powers began intervening in the in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea region was the threat of piracy and so on. But it has been quite effective. And in fact, if we look at the present scenario, they have been more or less successful in kind of combating Somali piracy and kind of stabilizing the situation. But now, ironically, the shift is to the other side. There is competition between the various maritime powers to gain access to bases in the region. So Oman still faces cyclones on a periodic basis because it is exposed to the Indian Ocean region vis-a-vis the other GCC states. So that is one area which both India and UK could collaborate. And Oman is a very important partner for both these countries. Though Oman has always been preferred a low-profile kind of way of foreign policy vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabia or UAE or even Qatar. So there is a lot that the UK and India can do with regard to Oman's frequent facing of cyclonic storms in that area. So plus humanitarian assistance in the Yemen conflict. There is a lot that both UK and India can do. Even if the conflict comes to an end, that is, the civil war comes to an end, there is a long phase of rebuilding that has to take place in Yemen before it covers up the damage that has been caused by the civil war. So, and I mean, we never know. The kind of threats of piracy and such things can come back to the region, if it moves on. So we better be prepared for greater collaboration from all sides, because it is not easy to police the seas without collaboration between maritime powers. Yeah.
What do you think will be Britain's contribution to maritime domain awareness in the Northern Arabian Sea there?
Actually, I'm not very much specialized in that particular area. But as my fellow panelist has mentioned, the UK has got a very long experience in dealing with maritime affairs. So I think that it can collaborate a lot in these areas in providing training and information to navies in the region. So I think there is a lot that Britain can bring to the table in that area. It's not my area of specialization.
Thank you, and we'll open it to the floor. Please identify yourself and ask the question. Professor Pradhan.
First of all, it was a wonderful panel, and your opening, Professor Lawrence, I think was mind-opening framework you suggested. I think a very, very complex geopolitical scenario, maritime space, Indo-Pacific, that I think very, very simple terms, you put it into several systems operating in the same space. If I understand your opening remarks, I would imagine that several political, geopolitical, economic, maritime and strategic systems and subsystems are operating within the larger framework, what we call Indo-Pacific. So each side we look at it, we see different scenarios, and everybody trying to manage conflict and trying to create convergence and all that. If we slightly expand this kind of a competitive approach, how do you see the Indo-Pacific to be looking at 2049, when China is looking at China Dream? We are looking at 2047, we are looking at India's 100 years of independence, and from the other perspectives, from Washington, from London, from Tokyo, China, how do you see the scenario in 2040s? Thank you.
Okay. We'll take some more questions and then all of us could do that. Yes, please. Your name and...
My name is Sujit Naya. I'm the chairperson of a geopolitical forum called Europe-India Center for Business Industry. We've been playing a role in promoting, building India's relationship with UK and EU for the past 12 years. Also happen to be the fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, just like Dr. David White. My question pertains to the UK part of the India-UK partnership. Considering that UK has been facing quite a few set of issues, domestic challenges in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, in addition to the Russian presence in the European door, do you think that UK has the substantial resources to sort of contribute to the partnership in the Indo-Pacific? It's open to any of the panelists who would like to answer the question. The question pertains to what UK can sort of contribute to the Indo-UK partnership in the Indo-Pacific domain, considering that UK has substantial challenges, domestic challenges, and also on the international front, there's Russians at the door, and a lot of resources should be sort of committed to UK to support the regions around it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Questions, and any panelist can answer this question. My first question pertains to the potential of Britain to undertake these projects in Indo-Pacific region, whether they have the potential, because Dr. Sidharth has highlighted from David Cameron's time, then David Cameron's health, then after that this Liz Truss was, Boris Johnson was there, Liz Truss was there, and the latest Rishi Sunak has highlighted that David Cameron's time of the ally China is no more. But at the same time, we will be adopting a very pragmatic approach in dealing with the Indo-Ocean strategy. Rishi Sunak's latest statement. So, considering the domestic economic compulsions and also the approach of the Labour Party in Britain, how effectively UK can pursue their Indo-Pacific strategy, taking into consideration of the interests of the other partners in the region. That is the question number one. Second question pertains to Dr. Shelly very highly pointed out. In the Indo-Pacific region, the northwest area should be taken into consideration. And also it is highlighted by the moderator, Dr. Prabhakar, that the non-traditional challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. If you read the latest integrated review research 2023, as mentioned by one of the panelists, it was highlighted that when Britain is attaching considerable importance to deal with Wagner militia, which is operating in the Sahel region of Africa, particularly in Mali and Picasso area, in the Sahel region of Africa. So, considering that they are taking very effective steps against the Wagner militia of Russia, and the state and non-state actors posing a challenge to the European or African region, whether such an approach will be taken in the case of the threats, especially from the northwest, from the Pakistan side of the state terrorists, non-state and the state actors that are causing much problem to the maritime security of India.
Yeah.
Very good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. I am Mohammad Reza Rafat. I am from Afghanistan. I have a specific question. It is not related to India-UK partnership in Indo-Pacific region, but it is related to India-UK relationship as a whole. As we see the history of India-UK partnership or relationship, we can see a lot of ups and downs, and it is not something sustainable. I think I see some gap here. Maybe the gap, as I see, maybe the gap is the absence of people-to-people relations here. Of course, government-to-government relations, But whenever we are speaking about the sustainable relationship, I think it is necessary that we have to make people-to-people relationship. In the case of India and UK, I think this gap is there. And the question here is that how we can close this gap and how we can make a sustainable relationship between India and UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me answer Professor Pradhan's, we'll come to a second round actually there. Professor Pradhan's question. I think 2047, 2049 will be a kaleidoscope of powers coming into the Indian Ocean region there. I think much will be explained by Admiral Luthra today evening when we look into the dinner talk where the great power competition is. But my take basically is that you'll find that all these powers will be jockeying for preeminence. There will be what we could call bandwagoning with the dominant powers, and you'll find an hierarchy of great powers, medium powers, middle powers, and smaller states. So therefore, there will be much in terms of each country trying to jockey for a preeminent position. Aid-giving, coalition building, and multinational partnerships will be the order of the day. Competitive infrastructure build-up will be one other aspect that will come into this place. And we will find that this competition will have both its benign as well as its adversarial prospects coming into the region there. Nuclear weapons will deter each other and they will not go to war actually there. And as long as deterrence works. And then of course we find that many of the low intensity conflicts in the region will also spur up owing to a variety of reasons of social strife or climate change induced conflicts could come. This is just a sample of what we can expect in that period of time. Others you could answer.
Maybe I'll take another shot at the sustainability question given. I think much depends on also, we haven't touched upon it much, but to us Indo-Pacific is the most important. As of now to Britain, I think Ukraine and how it ends, how that war ends is the most important pressing question. And so for us then it becomes, if we have to gauge sustainability and how much it can do, we have to then think in terms of what the future of Europe could look like. And that is something where India may have a say, or it could nudge different players in this direction or that. For instance, the Russia problem has been an irritant between Britain and UK over the last few years, not just 2022. It's obvious that for India, the primary interest is that Russia's tilt towards China is limited or doesn't even happen as a result of the war. I think the sentiment now seems to be that there's less and less India can do about that, and some of that is inevitable, which leads to its own closures, so to speak. But the best possible outcome is one where there is a stable, robust peace in Europe, where defense commitments and also the arming of Germany and Poland is another thing that's observers are trying to gauge what it would mean for the Anglo-Saxon powers and their commitments in Europe. Will we move towards a more autonomous, self-reliant Europe? If the continental powers in Europe are able to take a greater share of the burden in terms of maintaining peace and order in Eastern Europe, then it allows for both the US and Britain to then pivot more comprehensively. But that again doesn't seem very likely, in the sense that the role of Britain and US is likely to either maintain at the present levels or probably increase in the coming years. So given all of that, Britain will have to think of more nimble, more flexible, more creative, innovative ways of making its presence felt in the Indo-Pacific region. And for instance, as I've mentioned, AUKUS and helping different countries with joint production and defense industrial base cooperation is one such way. Cyber, I think we haven't mentioned, but I think Britain is looking at cyber assistance, help, framework, and to help a lot of countries in this regard. Again, the Ukraine war has shown the importance of cyber defenses and how much of a role that will play, especially with emerging tech situations coming up. So I think in terms of that, our expectations should also be aligned in such a way so that we don't swing between expecting too much and then getting disappointed and so on and so forth. So it has to be a flexible, intermediate, medium kind of a situation. And then also, of course, Britain will be relying on partner countries, it seems from the documents, to tell them how exactly, in what targeted ways their help would be most productive and useful. Again, so which leads so that means there's more need for such conferences and more thinkers and government officials to think along those lines to make the cooperation more targeted and more specific as we go forward.
Perhaps I can just add briefly to what Dr. Raimedhi said. I think there are two important things to remember when it comes to British engagement in the Indo-Pacific. First of all, yes, it's always going to be an external actor. Britain is not an Indo-Pacific regional power, but it is a European power with stakes and interests in the region. So we cannot, expect too much out of it. We cannot expect it to make Indo-Pacific its foremost priority. Its foremost priority is going to be the Euro-Atlantic region. And how the Euro-Atlantic, how the Ukraine war shapes up will, of course, shape a lot of British engagement in the Indo-Pacific. But what gives me optimism is that for the UK, by all accounts, the security in the Indo-Pacific is inherently linked to the Euro-Atlantic. So it looks at China, it looks at how China has become a factor in the Ukraine war, for instance, and in the long term, it sees how the geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region are ultimately going to affect its own outlook, its own policies, and how it interacts with not only its neighborhood but the region at large. So that is why we can expect it to continue to remain committed to the region, but we should also not expect it to act as a major regional power committing all its resources, but an external power with stakes in the region. So that is one distinction we have to make. The other question I think I can take up is regarding the people-to-people ties. I quite agree with you. I mean, yes, there is somewhat of a disconnect there, or perhaps to put it in a more positive way, there is a lot of room for improvement in that domain. And there have been some strides in the last couple of years again. For instance, with I think someone already mentioned this before, but the mutual recognition of university degrees, that's a huge step forward. There have also been some youth programs, youth exchanges that have come out. I think UK has invested some £75 million or something in student exchanges, scholarships, and so on for Indian students. So that, of course, there are things happening there which may not always be as visible. But what perhaps we can see in the future is deeper ties in the education sector. I mean, this is again a low-hanging fruit where UK can sort of take it up and really run forward with it. We could see UK trying to establish universities of sorts, some programs in India, training programs in India. It is already doing things like this in China, in Southeast Asia, for instance, with University of London international programs. There is the University of Nottingham, China branch, I think, in Ningbo, if I'm not wrong. So maybe we can visualize some sort of movements happening in that direction with the British degrees being provided in India to Indian students. So there is a lot of room there. Also in the think tank academia sector, that is one area which can really push forward bilateral engagement, I believe, moving forward.
Yeah, I would like to take up the question on what kind of steps the UK likely to take when it's faced with political and economic issues, problems in the domestically, the war in Ukraine and so on, how much it can focus on the Indo-Pacific. What we know about the UK is it's always its stand to defend the liberal international order. During the Second World War and the post-Second World War period. So definitely, if there is a sense that China is asserting itself in the Indo-Pacific and is likely to challenge the rule-based order, the freedom of navigation, definitely the UK would want to do something about it. But what would it do? That is, what is the kind of model that you would try to follow in the Indo-Pacific? One thing that comes to mind is what happened in West Asia in the context of the quote-unquote Arab Spring protests in North Africa and West Asia. What we see is during the conflicts that took place in the light of those protests, the civil wars that took place, it was the regional powers like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and so on, who took a more military intervention in those conflicts. And of course, backed up by the US and the UK wherever possible, but mainly it was the regional powers that have taken the initiative in dealing with the civil wars or intervening in the civil wars in that part of the world. So can we foresee such a model in the Indo-Pacific where we might expect, China, countering China by allowing the regional powers like South Korea, Japan, India, and so on to take a more proactive stance with regard to countering China, of course, with the help of the UK and the US. So that could be a model that could be followed out here. Now, when coming to the extremists in Pakistan, the Tehreek-e-Taliban and various extremist groups operating in Pakistan, one of the issues, one of the challenges that has been pointed out by Aisha Siddiqui, that is the Pakistani strategic studies expert, is the close relationship that exists between political and military elites in the UK and the Pakistani army. So these relations are quite strong, and if often how much criticism has been there with regard to Pakistan's role in providing shelter to the the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network in Pakistani territory during the war in Afghanistan. So maybe one kind of criticism that we can bring about is there an elitist kind of perspective with regard to foreign policy in the UK? Whereas, how much criticism has been there with regard to Pakistan's role in support for the Afghan Taliban during the insurgency? And how much has it been a political debate within the UK? Especially when we take into account that the US, the UK, Netherlands, and the Denmark have been involved in Operation Enduring Freedom, the counterinsurgency Operation Enduring Freedom, vis-a-vis other NATO allies who have been mostly involved in the reconstruction process. So how much debate has taken place in the UK? So are these relations a kind of hindrance to that kind of greater understanding? But the situation could change if the conflict that Pakistan is being engulfed in right now, and it affects the maritime security of the Arabian Sea, then it could have a major impact. Maybe the manner in which it's going to be looked at might change in such a context. It will not be like a conflict confined in Afghanistan. It is something that is moving on to the Arabian Sea or the sea lanes and so on. So that could change the perspective and the emergency of the situation on the ground in a place like Pakistan. So that is why, these are certain issues that can be of a kind of a sticky point with regard to between India and the UK. So we don't know how things are going to change at the ground level. Yeah, so I think I'll stop at that. Yeah, thank you.
We'll go for the last round of questions because time is running out quickly.
Hi, good afternoon all, and thank you for this insightful discussion. My name is Devansh, and I am second year master student at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal University. So my question is to Dr. Sidharth. Sir, as you cogently touched upon how the military dimension has been between India and UK, could you also expatiate on how military intelligence and cooperation has been between the two countries? And it is in a bit continuum to what Dr. Shelly mentioned regarding Pakistan. So how it has been over the years and what are the growth aspects?
Next question. Yes, please. Here. Okay. Please go ahead.
This question is for all the panelists. Sir, considering the fact that UK has had, international borrowings right now, and considering also the fact that in the past, 2 years, there has been no developments for the small and medium businesses because of the bureaucracy, do you think UK can actually afford to invest monetarily in the Indo-Pacific partnership?
Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you to all the panelists. My question is again, the theme of this session is decoding the Indo-Pacific. So how do we understand India-UK partnership in the broader context of geopolitical dynamics, particularly if I juxtapose India-UK partnership vis-a-vis India-EU partnership? EU, Germany, France, Netherlands still have a dedicated Indo-Pacific strategy, and UK hasn't come out with one. So how are India-UK ties going to play with India-EU ties in this particular region? Thank you.
Okay, and the answers, please. One more question. This is the last one. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Austin, and I'm a graduate from St. Joseph's College, Bangalore. So, in the recent meet between President of China and Russia, in the joint statement, it was mentioned that they will stand against the US Indo-Pacific strategy, which the Chinese foreign minister told that it involves Quad and it's Asian NATO. So my question is to all the panelists, are we seeing a Cold War scenario in respect to Indo-Pacific? If so, what will India's position be? Will it move again from multi-alignment to non-alignment, or your views on the matter? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Maybe I'll start with the last question. That is also that's the course that I also teach is the new Indo-Pacific, the new Cold War. So a bit easy for me, I guess. So I do think that we are seeing a new Cold War in the Indo-Pacific. And although a lot of Cold War diplomatic historians really disagree with that because they point to interdependence between US and China. It wasn't like that between US and Soviet Union. Also, the scale of the economy, China is much more of a genuine competitor economically than the Soviet Union ever was. And so there's no Warsaw Pact like the one the Soviet Union had. China is pretty much alone. And but if you just combine all of these variables, you still end up with a Cold War in a sense, plus minus here and there. And the Chinese rhetoric is that that we should not have another Cold War because it brings about zero-sum competition, geopolitics, instability. But we should be more careful about this rhetoric. And the moment we also join in and criticize or worry too much about whether this is a Cold War or not, or we should avoid a Cold War, it does feed into a certain narrative that other powers, that powers who are interested in resisting authoritarian expansionism are provoking, are causing, are sources of bad influence in the region. And hence, when the Ukraine war happened, Chinese internal debates saw what a great opportunity it was to blame NATO for the war, even though that argument really has no merit. Because for them, then you could say that similar situation, the Quad and an American influence in the region could provoke China towards the next conflict or whatever, so on and so forth. Regarding India, multi-alignment, so I don't think India will, of course, I mean, the answer is pretty clear. I mean, India will not be a part of any formal alliance, but it will try to cooperate under that threshold as much as it can with like-minded partners. So in that sense, India is very much part of the new and emerging Cold War. I would like to place the date on the beginning of this new Cold War around 2010 to 13. That's when I would say a lot of countries already took certain actions to anticipate China's rise, be it Japan in the East China Sea, be it Vietnam, and understandably so. I mean, they were also insecure. Philippines and Vietnam wanted to internationalize the South China Sea issue. And India's infrastructure development also in Ladakh was in a way hedging against this growing asymmetry of power between India and China. So the Cold War is very often characterized as a US-China situation. But again, if we look back at the last Cold War also, it had a lot to do with Germany and Soviet Union. And Soviet Union's entire military defense posture and diplomacy was geared towards pursuing its very regional, historic, traditional land-based threats and insecurities. So same way in this Cold War, it's multi-layered. So there is the China and its neighbors is the primary kind of a contest, and then US is the extra-regional hegemon who has a dog in the fight, so to speak. The second question on intelligence, I am afraid I do not know exactly what level of talks or what kind of intelligence cooperation is going on between India and Britain. But of course, Britain is part of the Five Eyes alliance, and given Five Eyes and given AUKUS, there might be some reservation or misgiving in India regarding Britain's own perception and assessment of its comfort and what kind of partners. Even in the defense, in IR integrated review and other documents, you see that Japan and other countries are seen as forming one tier of like-minded countries with whom you have comfort in sharing intelligence and other such cooperation. India is not really there yet, and maybe there is scope for more cooperation with Five Eyes without necessarily being a formal member. And one can also notice that Britain is spending a lot on launching advanced satellites. Anyway, so I'll hand it over to you.
I think I will take up the question regarding decoding the India-UK relationship in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is actually very, very difficult to answer because Indo-Pacific in itself is a complex domain, and there are a lot of overlapping mechanisms, overlapping partnerships, and to understand where the India-UK relationship, where we can position it is, I think, difficult. What I can say is that maybe we should look at their relations through a middle power diplomacy lens. When we talk about India's policy in the Indo-Pacific, I sort of fall into the camp that, India is pursuing a pointed alignment strategy. It has moved on from a multi-alignment kind of phase, and it is looking to identify key partners where it can have greater investments and where it can reap greater benefits. And I suppose that is where, UK comes in as as an important external partner in the Indian Ocean region, especially. I would say that for the UK, from UK's perspective, I think its outreach to the Indo-Pacific is driven, in part at least by the transatlantic alliance. It looks at what the US policy is, and generally it will be aligned to the US. That is why we can expect to see, AUKUS, for instance, it is an extension of the transatlantic alliance. But for India, I think that UK is an important middle power partner in the Indian Ocean region, and that's how I view it.
Well, thank you for the presentations, and thank you for the questions. I think time is up, so let me wind up this session there. And it's been a good discussion point. Thank you.